Good afternoon. My name is Mitch Pugh. I'm the executive editor here at the Post and Courier, and we welcome you to Beyond the Headlines, a regular Post and Courier virtual event where we take you a little behind the scenes and answer questions about the reporting and the journalism that we've been doing. Really appreciate you all coming out here on a beautiful Thursday afternoon to join us virtually to talk about Uncovered, the latest project from the Post and Courier. I'm joined here today by public service editor Glenn Smith and two reporters on our public service and watchdog team, Joey Cranney, who is based in Columbia, and Stephen Hobbs, who is here in Charleston. We really, again, appreciate you coming out today. A couple things about how the show is going to run today. We'll start by introducing our three panelists, have them talk a little about what they've been working on. At the end of today's presentation, you will receive an email that will have a recorded version of what we've talked about here today and additional information about the project, ways to contact our reporters for tips or questions. And then we'll also include some links to help you understand how to become a subscriber if you're not already, or if you want to donate to our public service and watchdog investigative fund, some information about how you might be able to do that as well. So thank you again for coming out. I thought I would start just by a brief summary for those of you who aren't as familiar with what Uncovered is, and I'll probably have Glenn talk a little bit more about that. But just in brief, we launched Uncovered February 14th. It's an initiative from the Post and Courier to work with smaller news organizations across the state where news deserts may have formed, where resources in those newsrooms aren't what they used to be. And our goal here is, again, to work together to provide some additional resources and expertise to go after the kinds of stories that take time and effort that some of these newsrooms just don't have the resources to do anymore. We've talked to many editors and reporters in these smaller towns that they're covering softball games, city council meetings, school board meetings, and trying to do this kind of work on the side. So it is a real challenge, and having that additional help and resources, I think, has been very beneficial. We have 16 partners all across the state in this initiative so far, and we're accepting more every day. We've published at least a dozen stories between ourselves and our partners, taking a look at issues with public spending, the trails of public trust all across the state. So, Glenn, I want to turn it over to you, and maybe if you can just start off by explaining who you are and what you do, and a little bit about sort of the lessons that we've learned so far in a couple months of working on this project.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks everybody for tuning in. So I am the public service watchdog editor for the Post and Courier. That's basically, I'm in charge of the investigative team. There's six of us on the team. There's Stephen and a few others here in Charleston, and then Joey and another fellow, Avery Wilkes, up in Columbia. And we also have partners in our Greenville Bureau and other spots that are chipping in on this. So we came up with this interesting idea to try to partner with papers. We'd never done something like this before across the state. It's been a bit of a learning experience, and it's been really fun and pretty cool. The model is extremely flexible. Some places just don't have the bandwidth to contribute a ton of resources to this. So if they can lend their community expertise, institutional knowledge, and point us in the right direction, and also consult with us through this on stories, we're happy to produce stories that they can run without a lot of effort or involvement on their part, manpower wise. Other folks have chosen to take what we come up with and write their own stories off of that, which is really neat. And then some have partnered with us. Joey's working on something right now where we're partnering with a paper, co-reporting, co-writing that. We've done that a couple times so far. That's been a really exciting process as well. And I think it's going to reap benefits for the years to come.
Great. Let's turn to Joey, who's in Columbia. For those of you who don't know, we have a newsroom in Columbia. It has an office, although not a lot of folks are going to the office these days. But we've got 11 journalists based up there. Joey's one of them, and you guys just we're working on an installment of this. Do you want to talk a little bit about what your role has been in this project and some of your key takeaways as you've worked through this?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I've been at the Post and Courier for a little more than 3 years now. My first investigative story involved a prosecutor in Colombia who was siphoning public money for all kinds of personal expenses and traveling all over the globe and bringing his girlfriend on vacations and charging taxpayers. We did a series of articles on that. He ultimately went to prison. In the years since, myself, along with other reporters, have investigated the state's sheriffs. I'd spent a year investigating the state's circuit judges and magistrate judges. And most recently, I've written a little bit about police misconduct in Colombia. With Uncovered, it's a really exciting project because it really drives the themes of what I'm passionate about, which is local accountability and hyperlocal accountability journalism. There's really no other institutions left in America that are looking out for everyday citizens and taxpayers, keeping an eye on city halls and your local schools and your local water districts of how public resources are being operated and handled. And with us, with Uncovered, we've basically been scouring the state. I've teamed up with the other reporter here in Columbia to look at some special purpose districts in the upstate, these small little islands of government that have really significant influence and oversee a great deal of public money, but operate with very little oversight. And right now I'm working on another story about a school district in the Midlands partnering with a local paper nearby. So to me, the whole idea and the concept of the project is really exciting because it drives at, what I'm passionate about. I think what most reporters are passionate about at the Post and Courier, which is journalism in the public interest.
Thank you, Joey. Stephen, you're relatively new to the Post and Courier as well, but no stranger to accountability reporting. I think for those of you who remember the prison project that we did a year and a half ago, Stephen and Jennifer Berry Hobbs were the lead writers on that. But Stephen, talk a little bit about what your role is here and the work that you've done so far in the Uncovered package and some key takeaways or things that have really stood out to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me today. And yes, I've been here for a little over 2 years now, so I'm the rookie of this panel. But yeah, it has been an extension of some of the accountability work that I've done, but really being able to dig into the state, which has been great. And I had done some work maybe locally, and like you mentioned with the prison project, but that was kind of limited, obviously, in a certain location. And so the ability just to get out to different parts of the state is, I think, really important. And one of the things that, as we try to expand in the state and continue our reach, that this makes us be kind of a visible presence. And so that's been really exciting because I've worked at a couple other papers, and sometimes you might drive an hour away and then you're kind of bumping up against another paper and maybe people don't really know your name. But here it's like you can drive a couple hours and you say who you are and people start to know who we are. They're aware of us as a paper. And so I think that's really exciting to work at a place that that people in the State House are reading, that people across the state are reading. And so that, I think, gives these stories a lot more just emphasis and importance because we know that so many eyes are on them. And I think one thing that's kind of exciting and interesting for me is the fact that we've been unrolling kind of multiple stories throughout this process. And maybe one of the things that readers might not realize is sometimes how challenging that can be when you're focused on one thing. So like the first story I wrote about with a colleague was about a situation involving a council member in a town that's on the border with North Carolina. And so you're trying to get focused on what was going on there and should he been disclosing information. And then after that story publishes, I'm moving to write about a story with a colleague about a school district and a superintendent there. So it's completely different things that you're learning about, you're thinking about, state rules that you're thinking about. And so there's really a exciting part of the process, but also a challenge is just being able to move from one story to the next. This isn't one where you're spending a whole year digging into this one specific thing. We're looking at such a range of things, which is exciting, but also makes it a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. that's a good segue into one of the things that I wanted to talk a little bit about, and I'll turn to Glenn next on this one. But I think what's interesting about that is, as Stephen said, there's lots of different bodies of government that we've encountered in this process. Everything from these very small gas districts, the school boards, and city councils that you may have heard of. But there's a lot of similarities in this reporting and what we're finding. We're finding that the traditional watchdogs in most communities aren't as prevalent as they once were, whether that be media like the Post and Courier or other news organizations that we're partnering with. The federal government used to do a lot more investigations into these sorts of accusations and potential misdeeds. And the state itself, with its ethics oversight, is very lax, and there's not a lot of accountability. And that's one of the key things that I think that we found in this is, it's pretty easy these days to slide by with some of these indiscretions. But Glenn, the reason we do a lot of this work, as Stephen was saying, sure, it's enjoyable for us. We like to get out and see different parts of the state and experience different stories, et cetera. But the reason we do this is because there are things that need to be changed, and the critical piece of this, I think, that we always sometimes skirt past is, this work does have an impact, and we're already starting to see impacts from the journalism that you all have been doing since early February, mid-February. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what the response has been to the project, both from the communities that we've been going into and working with, but also from lawmakers and other agencies that have the ability to provide some additional oversight?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. One thing is, I think everyone touched on here is, the steep learning curve in this, and also the breadth of it covering the state. And one thing we've noticed in that is questionable actions, questionable spending. That is not, isolated to one particular part of the state. It is all over the place. We've found instances of just abusive spending, conflicts of interest, nepotism, all sorts of insider dealing and other questionable conduct, literally in like every corner of this state. In agencies, some agencies we didn't even know existed when we started out on this thing. And I guess the common thread that runs through all this is these are places that in large part haven't received a lot of scrutiny. Once you don't have a bright light shining on some of these places, people seem to take it into their own hands to do things that they probably should not. So the reaction from the communities, I think it's been generally very positive. We've had over 70 tips, I think, come in, and these aren't just sort of loose suggestions on broad topics. These are like isolated things that come with documents attached and specific people to look into. And thank you for doing this. We really want, we need somebody to come in and do this. As far as official reaction on this, it's been pretty impressive as well. 72 hours after we published the first installment, which looked at the gas authorities and these special purpose districts, the governor and several lawmakers called for tightening up the scrutiny and regulation of these special purpose districts, and to tighten their reporting requirements to the State Ethics Commission. One thing, some of these gas authorities were not required to report gifts like other agencies were. Now they're pushing to do that. Another group of lawmakers in the Greenville area are pushing to have a task force to look at special purpose districts and see what needs reforming there. They have just a ton of those up in that area of the state. We also reported, our colleague Anna Mitchell up in the Greenville Bureau reported on the trash authority up there, planning to take a very pricey $14,000 for a couple-day trip up to this really nice luxury resort outside Asheville. As soon as we reported on that, the gas authority canceled plans to go on that retreat, changed its plans, and from now on we'll be meeting closer to home where it's not going to jack up the costs for ratepayers. What else? Let's see. Just last week, the Senate passed a budget that would include about $160,000 for a forensic auditor for the state law enforcement division. For years, the SLED has depended on local, they're the top law enforcement agency in the state. And for years, they have depended on local governments to hire auditors because they don't have somebody to go in there and do those sort of white collar crime analysis. So that delays the investigations. It delays bringing people to justice on those charges. This could go a long way to speeding up that process. Also, one of our last pieces involved the latest governor's school, which is sort of an elite public academy boarding school up in McCormick County. And Tony Bartlemy delved into there and found out that there'd just been millions spent on this place. It was still in pretty rough shape. The former head of the school had just gone to work for the consultant, making $1,500 a day. And there were some questionable contracts awarded. And this was a good example too of the uncovered partnership, because we exposed all this stuff that was going on in the school that most people I don't think even knew was there. It's an agricultural school, or will be, they hope. And our partner on that, the Index Journal of Greenwood, they stepped right in there. They went with us on these things. And then the day after, they found out that the board was meeting in an emergency session to discuss how to respond to our article. They sent somebody there. They called them out on the fact that the meeting was probably illegal because they had called an executive session to discuss responding to our article, which does not comply with the state's open record laws. Now they're going into looking even deeper into some of these contracts and the relationships, and area lawmakers are taking notice and promising to take a hard look at the practices of that school. So a lot's happening.
Right. Yeah, and again, that's what you hope to see with work like this, is not just that we've pointed out things that are maybe a little questionable, but that then there's some activity and some action on the other end of that. And, Glenn, in the first story that we wrote, introducing in this project, wrote a lot about how where there are, this sort of level of accountability, whether it be through a newspaper or a government agency, you tend to see things like, your tax dollars being taxed less and having more turnout for elections, less, partisanship, et cetera. So, these things all have a good long-term impact. One of the things I don't think people understand a little bit, and I get this question a lot, is, how do you know you're being fair? How do you ensure that everything you're reporting on is accurate? So I'm going to ask a couple of different questions. First, I'm going to put Joey on the spot a little bit. Joey, how many pages and documents do you think you've read as part of this project? I know we've been counting, and I know there's been some counts of like the number of volumes of War and Peace maybe that we've gotten through and going through documents. But can you talk a little bit about, I don't think people realize how much of your job is sitting there going through spreadsheets and documents that are really boring.
Yeah, I've easily read thousands of pages of public records myself, just this year working on this project alone. And that's a regular part of my job, is requesting, reviewing public records. And often you review them and you don't find anything worth writing about and you move on. But even that is time consuming. And as a reporter with daily responsibilities to my editor and an investigative reporter who wants to be constantly pursuing and publishing public service journalism, you have to kind of find the time to do that kind of work, which is why it's so important at the Post and Courier that we have a dedicated team of investigative journalists, where our bosses say, take the time you need to run this stuff down, to read these records. But it's really, really painstaking. I'm reading through monthly credit card statements, flagging expenses I think are questionable, putting it into a spreadsheet, analyzing it, preparing lists of questions for officials. That's usually where I start with stories like this.
It's painstaking work. And then you get done and you do all that work, you write a story, you turn in a draft to your editors. We all go through it. Sometimes we'll do a read aloud and we'll pick it apart. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part, Stephen, if you can talk a little bit about that, is the fact check, right? So you talk to our audience a little bit about what a fact check looks like, how long it takes, and what that's like to go through as a reporter.
Yeah, you talk about kind of being fair in that gut check. This is the part that our goal really is to be able to sleep well at night before the story runs. So it's kind of the ability just to look at your story and say, okay, how did I get that fact? How did I get that word? how can I say this detail? And going through and kind of interrogating your own story. And sometimes that process can take, as Glenn would know, days sometimes as I'm debating whether to use this word or that word. But, I view it as an important part of this kind of whole process, right? It's like, that's the part when you really want to get that information right. And so sometimes that means checking yourself. So I have a sentence written a certain way. I might call someone who isn't aware of the story or just is an expert on something and just run this by them and say, does this sound fair? Does this sound right based on the facts? And if they say yeah, or if they say, oh gosh, no, or maybe if you change that word, that's so important because when we run a story like this, the stakes are high. We want to get everything right. And so we'd rather hear about something before we publish than after. So it's really important part of the process and one that, I think people don't realize how difficult that is to try to get together. But then the great part is once you're done with it, you can feel good about the story that you have. And then when it publishes, you're ready to go. So.
As far as I know, we've not run any corrections on this project yet. So that's always a good sign. A couple questions are starting to come in from readers in the live chat. So I'm going to start there. So I think a couple of these kind of dovetail what we've been talking about. So Seth Harrison asks a good question here. And, I think this goes to sort of how we report on these stories and the depth that's involved. But, he's asking, as you develop background in the various special purpose districts and these obscure state agencies, will you publish a background piece about the governance, funding, and purpose of the district and agency? We kind of do a little bit of that in these initial stories, but can you talk a little bit about, Glenn, about how you balance giving that background and that history with also then reporting on what's happening now?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually been struggling with that myself this week because I got a story going in this weekend, and I'm going through this entire fact-checking process, and also context is like very important, right? I mean, especially for readers who aren't familiar with the topic at hand. So you want to provide enough context in there so that they understand what the backdrop and history is of the issue and what's at stake, without getting in the way, I guess, of the story and delving into the issue at hand that's bringing it to the fore as we speak there. So that's it's a delicate balancing act, but yeah, you always have to put in as much information as you can to help readers understand these things. And I think we try to do that as much as possible to go deep and give them a sense of that history.
I think a good example of that is the very first investigative story that was part of this. I think Tony was the lead writer on that, Tony Bartleby, who's not on the call today, but that was about the gas authorities. And I thought that was really fascinating. He really delved deep into the history of why these things even existed and how they came to be. I think it really did help inform that story. Another good question from Nan Fetters. And I know we all have strong feelings about this one. So I don't know who wants to take this. If it's, maybe we'll throw this one to Joey first, but how does South Carolina, because I know you've worked in Florida and other states, how does South Carolina compare to other states in regards to FOIA requests? I'm wondering why it is so difficult to find outcomes of court decisions on particular cases. We as taxpayers pay the salaries of prosecutors, and yet it is not possible to find out how they handle a particular case. And I know you guys deal with this all the time. So Joe, you want to talk a little bit about how South Carolina's FOIA law works from your perspective and how that might compare to other places?
Sure. I think the nicest way to put it is it's very much a mixed bag. I think the public's access to public records is paramount for any state. I happened to work in Florida for a couple of years, which Stephen did as well, which is known for having really great open records laws where any citizen can really go online, easily review their local town or county's council meeting minutes, great online access to court records where you can review complaints and lawsuits or underlying documentation in criminal cases. That's not the case in South Carolina. The court record system is quite archaic, quite difficult to search through. And as we've seen through our reporting and our interactions with our partner newspapers in Uncovered, the state's FOIA law, the Freedom of Information Act in South Carolina, it presents a lot of hurdles for reporters or citizens who are just trying to gain access to basic public records. The way the law is written, it gives officials and local governments great leeway to charge expenses for the time or the work it takes to prepare some of these records. And on one hand, that's fair. There should be a reasonable expectation for governments to charge people for the work they have to do to compile records. But the law is written in a little bit of a gray area, and we've found that it's really easy for officials who are interested in blocking access to records they don't want people to see to hit you with steep fees, hundreds if not thousands of dollars just for access to public records. And that can right there end a story. If you can't read the records, you need to read it. It's a significant challenge.
Absolutely. Joey mentioned, Stephen, that you worked in Florida as well, and I think you've worked in other states. Is there one thing you would like to see changed about the South Carolina FOIA law? If you were a lawmaker and could just take a magic wand over the law, what's the first thing you'd want to see changed? The fees or something else?
I think it's the accountability. To Joey's point, and I think just the point is the ability for the average person to kind of put this law and our agencies and make them accountable. Because I think what happens is if I file a request and the agency doesn't want to comply, the next real best step is to sue. And that's a big jump. So maybe if there was a public advocate or the attorney general's office or something that could handle some of these requests, where like I'm a member of the public, I could send my FOIA dispute to this arbiter, that this judge that could say, yeah, they deserve those records, they should get them, because that's a big jump. That we even have those questions of, is this worth our time and effort to try to sue? And so your average citizen who's just trying to find out information, that's going to be really prohibitive. And like Joey was saying, that can end a story, it can end a pursuit of records just right there. And I think that there needs to be more that people are able to do beyond just filing a request and having to sue.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing that sometimes people forget when we talk about the FOIA law, is that this isn't written for us as journalists. It's written for taxpayers and the people that these agencies serve, and they're your records. They're not the public officials' records. They're your records. And I think that's a thing that gets missed sometimes. Glenn, you were raising your hand there.
Yeah, I feel pretty passionately about open records, as you know. I agree with what they say. I'm from Connecticut originally. I've been here 20 years at the paper, so I guess I've been here the longest. But what I can remember of Connecticut was that they had an independent panel that you could appeal to if somebody turned you down or they wanted to charge you outrageous fees. You didn't have to hire a lawyer. You could go before the panel, make your case, and then they'd make a decision pretty quickly. You didn't like the decision, then you could take the step to go to court and fight that. But it's difficult for us as a newspaper to go after some of these things. But imagine the average person who's living on a tight budget, and they really want to know something about how their government operates. They could just stop them in their tracks like that by jacking the fees up.
That's absolutely true. One of the questions that came in before this, and I know we're getting close to the bottom of the hour, but some questions were submitted prior to noon today. One came from Mayor Baracco, and Joey, this is kind of for you. She wanted to know, if there's any follow-ups we have planned on the magistrate court issues that you wrote about. Was that last year or 2 years ago? Gosh, the time flies in COVID. But you definitely dug into that in a deep way. Is there more to come on that, or can you give us an update on where we stand with that?
The latest is that several prominent state officials, including the governor, have called for significant changes to how the magistrate system is structured and the level of oversight that magistrate judges have. But none of them have really done anything about it besides making calls. Our reporting in 2019 revealed the breadth of this issue is significant. It was just about every corner of the state recently has had significant issues with local magistrate judges. These are influential, important jurists who have significant sway over criminal and civil cases in every county, and the state does not require them to have any formal legal training. We found that most of them are not lawyers and have never practiced law in their lives. And they've been found year after year to have either abused their positions or misapplied the law, and it results in serious consequences for the people who appear before them. The initial reaction was quite strong. Senator Tom Davis in Beaufort filed legislation that would install much more significant levels of scrutiny to magistrates and to tighten some of the qualifications for the people who can take the bench in these counties. But that sat there for more than a year and a half. COVID, to be fair, sucked a lot of the oxygen out of the room in session last year, but that bill filed by Tom Davis more than a year ago has not even gotten a hearing in judiciary at the Senate.
And unfortunately, that's sort of the norm in South Carolina. It takes a long time to get a lot of these reforms passed. That's why some of the stuff that Glenn talked about earlier was so remarkable. That things moved quickly. Jan Luth, I'm sorry, in the chat asked a question, and I think I can answer as part of the way of kind of wrapping this up as we hit the bottom of the hour. She mentioned this challenge is happening all across the country, and she wants to know, is this a model that other states are considering? And Jan, you're right, it is a problem, all across the country as we see news deserts develop. Glenn Smith wrote a great story about this to kick off the project. You can still find on the project website at postingcourier.com/uncovered. Yes, news deserts are forming all across the country in small enclaves, but also even in larger cities where there's an additional problem that those of us in the industry call ghost papers, where there's still a newspaper, it still gets distributed, but there's very, very few writers left and very, very few editors left to really cover that community in a way that it deserves. So you're right, it is a problem that is pervasive. We've actually talked with several news organizations across the country, 2 or 3 at least that I can think of, that are considering, I don't think anything's launched yet, but they're considering similar projects in their states, Louisiana and North Carolina among them. And that's really great to hear and see. The Washington Post announced a similar initiative with their magazine a couple weeks ago. So I do think you're starting to see more attention and more focus put on this issue, because as we wrote in Glenn's story, the lack of these news organizations in these communities, the lack of the watchdog work, the lack of accountability leads to less effective governments in places that aren't as good of places to live as they used to be. And it's really that simple. And so that's one of the reasons, as we wrap up here, that when we published this project on February 14th, it came along at the same time as we launched our public service and investigative reporting fund. And thank you to all of you who have contributed to that fund. We've raised nearly $500,000 since February 14th, which is just remarkable. Our initial goal was $100,000 in 100 days. So thank you so much. I think it was really a clear signal to us that this work is valued and is important. Some of those have come in with big dollar donors. We've had anything from $10 to $150,000 in individual gifts. And so we're very thankful for that. If you'd like to contribute to that fund and haven't, you may do so at postingcourier.com/donate. They're tax deductible. It's administered through the Coastal Community Foundation. They make sure that everything's above board and that your donation can be deducted from your taxes. So we really appreciate that. Of course, we appreciate our subscribers, who I know many of you are. You can subscribe today also at postingcourier.com/subscribe. Again, we appreciate that support, whether you're a subscriber or donor or both. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We can't do this kind of work without you, as Joey and Stephen and Glenn talk. A lot of this work becomes very time consuming and very expensive, whether it be through the hours that we spend poring over all of these documents or the extraordinary FOIA fees that we get charged for some of these projects. So that support allows us to do this work. So thank you so much. Again, when we're done here today, you'll get an follow-up email with a recording of this presentation. It'll include information about how to subscribe and donate, but it'll also include contact information for Joey and Stephen and Glenn. They both have, all three of them have secure emails through Proton Mail and other ways that you can reach out if you're concerned about that, to share information and share documents. That'll all be included in that email. So please do feel free to reach out with questions, tips, as Glenn said, we've gotten dozens and dozens of tips, and we've taken them all very seriously, and some of them have even resulted in stories that have been published. So we really, really appreciate that as well. So again, please look out for that email. We'll have all that information, links to the project. Again, postandcourier.com/uncovered if you want to read everything that we've done on this project. We appreciate your support, appreciate your interest, and we're at the bottom of the hour. So wish you all a happy Thursday, and have a great weekend. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
The stories I've done that I'm proudest of are stories that if we weren't able to commit our skills and our time to them, might not otherwise have been told. Governments and institutions are actually pretty equipped at obscuring or outright trying to hide the truth from the public. And there are very few watchdogs that have the skills and the resources to really dig for the truth. So it's important at the Post and Courier that we have that mission. Good reporting is expensive. So if you value the kind of public service journalism that the Post and Courier has a record of doing in South Carolina, there's really no better way for you to support that than to pay for a subscription.